The shot rang out before I could even turn around. One moment, Emily was giggling, blowing soap bubbles into the warm spring air, and the next, she lay crumpled on the pavement, blood soaking through her pink dress. Judith Crowley stood on the sidewalk with a smoking pistol in her shaking hands, eyes wide, whispering to no one in particular. I was just scared. But let me take you back. Back to the part before everything fell apart. Back when we still believed a little town like ours could be safe. 2 weeks earlier, life in Sycamore Hills was decent, predictable, suburban in the kind of way that made you both grateful and mildly bored. I'd moved there for my daughter, Emily. She was 6 years old, born with spina bifida, and had more strength in her tiny hands than most men I served with in the Army. After my wife passed during childbirth, I promised myself I'd build Emily a world where she could feel free, safe, seen. And Sycamore Hills, with its trimmed lawns, peaceful cul-de-sacs, and quiet neighbors, felt like a good place to start. We'd been in our modest, one-story home on Maple Drive for almost a year. Emily loved it, the squirrels in the backyard, the flower beds we planted together, and especially her service dog, Milo, a golden retriever trained to alert me if she needed help. Every afternoon after school, she'd roll her chair out onto the driveway while Milo lay at her side, tongue-lolling. That driveway was her playground, her stage, her escape. Our next-door neighbor was Judith Crowley, or as most in the neighborhood called her behind closed doors, HOA Karen. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the Sycamore Hills Homeowners Association. Mid-60s, always in beige cardigans and pressed slacks, she had a clipboard in one hand and suspicion in the other. I didn't think much of her at first. Sure, she was nosy, but what HOA board member wasn't? The first letter came tucked under our door one evening, a printed notice from the HOA stating that medical equipment or visual distractions were not to be stored in public view, citing Emily's portable oxygen tank and foldable ramp as inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. I blinked. At first, I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But when I showed it to Emily's school therapist, her face turned hard. "They can't do this," she said. "This violates ADA guidelines." I politely brought it up with Judith the next morning. She was out front trimming her hedges when I walked over. "Hey, I just wanted to ask, did you write this letter?" She smiled tight, not looking up from her hedge clippers. "As a board, we're simply trying to maintain a certain standard, Mr. Reed. We've had complaints." "About what?" I asked, trying not to let my voice rise. "The ramp," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "The tubes. The setup. Some residents feel it's alarming. They say it makes the neighborhood look like a hospital zone." "It's for my daughter," I said. "You know she's disabled, right?" Judith's face didn't change. "Of course. And we have great sympathy. But this is a residential area, not a clinic. Maybe consider placing things out back or storing the equipment when not in use." That conversation stuck with me. It was the first time I felt the real weight of what Judith represented. Not just a neighbor, but a gatekeeper. A person who looked at my daughter's mobility equipment and didn't see necessity or survival, only clutter. Still, I tried to keep peace. Emily didn't need me fighting battles she didn't fully understand yet. But she did start asking questions. Why did Ms. Crowley say I couldn't draw with chalk on the driveway? Why did she yell at Milo yesterday? Did I do something wrong? "No, baby," I always told her. "You didn't do anything wrong." The second incident came a few days later. Emily had drawn a huge chalk mural, flowers, butterflies, stick figures of me, her, and Milo. When I got home from running errands, I found her sobbing in the living room. Outside, the chalk had been washed away. Judith stood at the edge of her property, garden hose in hand. "Sidewalk art isn't permitted," she said before I could open my mouth. Rules are rules. That night, I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board. I knew it wouldn't go anywhere. Judith chaired the board, and most of the other members were either her friends or too afraid to stand up to her. But I wanted something on record. I also installed a second ring camera, one facing the driveway, just in case. Still, Emily bounced back. She always did. She was the kind of kid who could make a hospital room feel like a fairy tale. Her laughter was contagious. Her joy didn't just fill rooms, it poured out the windows and wrapped around the yard. Even Milo seemed to feed off her energy. But that joy, that peace, started to feel fragile. One evening, I was grilling in the backyard when I saw Judith standing on the sidewalk again. She was staring at Emily, who was playing with her talking tablet, instructing Milo to roll over. Judith's lips moved, and I couldn't hear the words, but her face was full of disdain. Not fear, not concern, disgust. I waved. She turned away. That weekend, Emily and I went to the community pool. Well, we tried. At the front desk, the young clerk looked nervous. I'm really sorry, Mr. Reed, but there was a board vote last night. Only registered swimmers are allowed in the pool area, and the board denied Emily's access. My stomach dropped. Denied? Why? She's not able-bodied, the clerk mumbled. It's about liability. I saw red. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. But I walked Emily back to the car, my jaw tight, my hands shaking. She didn't ask questions that time. She just stared out the window. Her eyes were dry. That night, I filed a discrimination complaint with the state. I attached video evidence, emails, everything I had. I wasn't going to sit back anymore. But I didn't know. I couldn't have known that Judith would take it so far. That the petty wars she started with letters and whispers would end in blood. 2 weeks later, I stood in our driveway, holding Emily's new art set. She was a few feet away, chasing bubbles in her wheelchair, Milo wagging his tail beside her. It was a rare calm afternoon. No HOA notices. No angry neighbors. Just a peaceful sky and a daughter's laughter echoing in the air. Then I heard footsteps, then a dog bark, then the shot, and all I could hear after that was my own screaming, Judith's voice muttering the same empty phrase again and again. I was just scared. I didn't mean to, but she did. God help me, she did. And this is what happened next. The first letter arrived in a plain envelope without a return address. It was printed in bold font with official-looking HOA letterhead, though the language read more like a veiled threat than a neighborhood notice. It claimed that non-conforming medical apparatus had been observed on the property and instructed immediate removal of unsightly or disruptive objects from public visibility. At first glance, it appeared like standard overreach, an overzealous board nitpicking something trivial. But upon closer reading, the phrases used made it clear exactly who they were targeting: the portable oxygen equipment and custom-built wheelchair ramp used by a disabled child. In the following days, similar notices began appearing more frequently. One complaint stated that a service animal was persistently disruptive, referencing the golden retriever trained to assist with medical alerts and support. Another claimed that audible distractions such as talking tablets and mechanical wheels had been disturbing the peace. The wording danced around legality, but left no room for misinterpretation. The child's very existence was being painted as a nuisance to the neighborhood. Soon after, a new letter announced changes in HOA leadership. Judith Crowley had been elected as acting president, replacing the previous chair, who had quietly stepped down. With her appointment, the tone of the correspondence shifted from passive-aggressive to openly hostile. More detailed complaints followed, often referencing vague, multiple resident concerns. They described the home as appearing visually degraded, citing the ramp as a permanent fixture inconsistent with neighborhood character, and accusing the family of bringing down property values with excessive accommodations. Judith didn't stop at letters. She began appearing at the property regularly, sometimes alone, other times with clipboard-wielding HOA board members in tow. She would stand at the edge of the driveway, pointing, whispering, taking photos, documenting things that had nothing to do with property violations. Flower pots, sidewalk chalk drawings, wind chimes. She even once gestured disapprovingly at a smiling welcome mat. When questioned about her presence or intentions, Judith maintained an air of exaggerated courtesy. She claimed she was monitoring compliance and conducting inspections for the safety of all residents, but her words barely concealed the disdain in her eyes. When Asked why she continued to cite the child's medical equipment in her notices, she replied that special cases shouldn't mean special privileges. When pressed further, she stated flatly, some people just don't belong in structured communities. Meetings with the HOA board proved fruitless. The complaints were vague, the citations arbitrary, and the enforcement inconsistent. Whenever any pushback was offered, Judith quickly shifted responsibility to the board consensus or claimed the complaints were merely her interpreting the needs of the community. She often cited HOA bylaws out of context and dismissed any mention of federal disability protections as irrelevant to aesthetic management. Despite the increasing hostility, efforts were made to de-escalate. Each letter was logged and saved. Each interaction was recorded when possible. The goal wasn't retaliation, it was survival. There was a hope, however naive, that by staying polite and cooperative, Judith's behavior would de-escalate or at least expose itself under the weight of evidence. But the opposite happened. Her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she'd knock on the door under the guise of a courtesy warning. Other times, she would leave laminated notices on the mailbox detailing minor infractions. A wheel of the ramp touching the lawn, the dog barking when a delivery driver arrived, a garish sticker on the back window of the wheelchair. She even questioned why the child needed a service dog at all. "It's a little excessive, don't you think?" she asked during one exchange. "It's not like she's blind." Behind closed doors, some neighbors voiced sympathy, but none stepped forward. A few suggested privately that Judith was just old-fashioned or really into rules. Others admitted she made them uncomfortable, but were unwilling to say anything publicly. Her influence in the HOA was too strong, and no one wanted to be her next target. Worse still, Judith began involving other residents in subtle acts of exclusion. Community activities that once welcomed all ages suddenly had unspoken limitations. The monthly street fair removed the designated accessible seating. The neighborhood newsletter stopped including inclusive language and began referencing a need for standards. It was as though Judith was orchestrating a silent campaign, not just of regulation, but of rejection. The child noticed too. Once cheerful and open, she grew quieter. She hesitated before going outside. She asked why neighbors stopped waving, why the sidewalk art she'd drawn had been scrubbed away overnight, why the service dog, who used to be everyone's favorite visitor, was now avoided like a threat. She was too young to fully grasp the malice behind the behavior, but old enough to feel its weight. Judith's rhetoric also began to escalate in ways that made her intentions unmistakable. She began saying things like, this neighborhood has a certain way of life to protect. When asked to clarify what that meant, she would shrug and offer vague remarks about people knowing their place. Once she was overheard saying, "If you want to live differently, maybe try a place that doesn't have standards." When challenged legally by citing ADA guidelines and fair housing laws, she scoffed. "You think government rules mean anything to a homeowners association?" she said in one heated exchange. "We govern ourselves here." Despite the evidence, local officials were hesitant to intervene. HOAs operated with significant autonomy, and unless a direct legal violation could be proven, most disputes were considered civil matters. The burden fell on the family to gather documentation, file formal complaints, and navigate a bureaucratic maze that moved slower than the harassment accelerated. What had started as a few notices quickly became a sustained campaign of isolation, shaming, and exclusion, all under the banner of neighborhood standards. The most disturbing part was that Judith seemed to genuinely believe she was doing the right thing. She spoke with the conviction of someone convinced of their own moral superiority. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was trying to erase difference, to sanitize the image of the neighborhood until it reflected only her idea of who belonged. Behind her polite tone and passive-aggressive smiles lay something darker. A coldness, an obsession with control, a calculated effort to make life so unbearable that compliance or departure seemed like the only options. She didn't want accommodation, she wanted disappearance. But What Judith didn't expect was resistance. Quiet, strategic, determined resistance. She didn't know that every word she said was being transcribed, that every letter she sent was being archived, that behind the front door she so often glared at, preparations were being made, not for retaliation, but for exposure. Because this wasn't just about one child, it was about every family who had ever been told they didn't belong. Every person who had ever been made to feel like their needs were an inconvenience. And as Judith tightened her grip on the HOA and pushed harder toward her imagined ideal, she unknowingly planted the seeds of her own undoing. The targeting had begun, but it wouldn't end the way she expected. The first real sign that things were crossing into dangerous territory came on a Monday morning. It had rained lightly the night before, and the air still smelled of damp leaves. When the front door was opened, the ramp was splintered, not just cracked, but deliberately damaged. The screws that once secured the base had been pulled out, and one of the support beams was snapped in two as if someone had jumped on it repeatedly with boots or used a crowbar. The edges were jagged and dangerous. A sharp wooden shard jutted upward like a spear. The ramp wasn't just convenience, it was essential. Without it, the child couldn't get in or out of the house independently. That morning, she sat quietly in her chair, watching her father inspect the damage. No tears, no questions, just silence. The kind of silence that comes from a child who's beginning to understand cruelty in ways she shouldn't have to. A police report was filed immediately, but the responding officer offered little comfort. No cameras caught it? No witnesses? Then it's just vandalism unless we have a suspect, he said with a shrug, scribbling notes in a small pad. His tone was procedural, indifferent. Just another call. Just another minor crime. Never mind the impact it had on the girl, whose world was already confined to a few accessible spaces. Repairs were made, but the message had been sent. Someone, maybe more than one person, wanted to escalate beyond warnings and letters, and the next act confirmed it. 3 days after the ramp incident, the dog stopped eating. At first, it seemed like nothing. He was a picky eater, occasionally skipping meals, but then he vomited once, then again, then collapsed beside the water bowl, shivering. He was rushed to the vet, and the diagnosis was almost immediate: poison. Rat bait, to be specific. The vet saved him, but just barely. When asked how a trained service animal could have gotten into poison, the vet explained it was most likely placed in something enticing, like meat or cheese. Something wrapped and left where the dog could find it. Later that afternoon, the mailbox revealed an unsealed envelope with no postage. Inside was a printed flyer for a pest control company with a handwritten note in red ink: "Don't leave food out. It attracts rats." Nothing more. No signature. No threat, at least not in words. But the meaning was unmistakable. The dog's recovery was slow, and during those days, the house felt colder, quieter. The child began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming. Nightmares. She flinched at doorbells, and her laughter, once constant, became rare. Her questions changed, too. No longer asking why people were mean, but asking if it was her fault. If they hated her because she needed help, because she was different. Each time, the answer was the same: no, never. But words only go so far when a child starts to internalize fear. She began asking to stay inside, even on days when the sun poured golden light across the front lawn. She avoided the sidewalk entirely. Even Milo, once her guardian and partner, seemed nervous now, constantly alert, barking at shadows. Judith, meanwhile, maintained her pristine routine. Every morning she walked her own dog, a tiny white Pomeranian with a pink leash and matching collar. She never looked over, never spoke, but she always lingered near the property, always walked slower past the house than anywhere else on the street. Sometimes she would stop and pretend to check her watch or adjust her sleeve, facing the front windows as if trying to catch a glimpse of something she could report. One day, a group of kids from the neighborhood rode by on bikes. The child waved, hopeful. None of them waved back. A boy in the group, about her age, stuck out his tongue and shouted something she didn't understand. The others laughed. Later, one of the chalk drawings on the driveway was found scrubbed out with muddy footprints leading toward Judith's property. No one admitted anything. No one apologized. Then came the worst of it. Late one night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet and the streets were wrapped in shadow, the doorbell rang. It was unusual for anyone to come by at that hour, but not unheard of. A package, maybe a late Amazon delivery. But when the door opened, a flash of orange filled the night. Something small and fiery had been placed on the doormat. A brown paper bag, ignited from the top, the flames licking upward. It wasn't just a prank. The contents were soaked in accelerant, and the flames spread fast, scorching the doormat and blackening the trim of the door before being stomped out. Inside the bag, buried under the ashes and melted plastic, was a child's art project. The name Emily was still legible on a singed corner. Footage from the Ring camera confirmed what had been suspected all along. A teenage boy, face partially obscured by a hoodie, had approached from the side of the property. He looked hesitant, glancing behind him several times. But when he lit the match, there was no hesitation. The flame caught instantly, and he sprinted down the driveway, disappearing into the darkness. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The boy was Judith's son, Eli Crowley. The video was turned over to police. Another report was filed. This time there was a face, a name. But instead of immediate arrests or accountability, there were delays. Explanations. Eli was a minor. It had to go through juvenile channels. He had no record. His mother insisted it was just a teenage prank gone wrong. The fire wasn't that bad. No one was hurt. And besides, what proof do you have that the art was your daughter's? She asked. That comment, that final cold dismissal, marked a shift. What had once been fear began to harden into something else. Not anger, not vengeance, something deeper, a quiet resolve, because no amount of meetings, recordings, or neighborly patience had slowed Judith down. In fact, she seemed emboldened, as if each act of harassment was proof that she was untouchable. The harassment wasn't random. It was deliberate, strategic, designed not to wound in one blow, but to wear down spirit over time. It wasn't just about the child. It was about control, power. The HOA rules were just tools. The real aim was submission or disappearance. And yet, there was still no public outrage. No neighbors knocked on the door to ask what happened. No HOA members resigned. No one apologized. The silence of the neighborhood, that deep complicit silence, was the final layer of cruelty. Everyone saw what was happening. No one wanted to get involved, but Judith had miscalculated. She assumed that fear would force retreat, that constant pressure would lead to surrender. What she didn't realize was that all she was doing was building a mountain of evidence, that the cameras were still rolling, that every violation, every smirk, every visit, every anonymous letter, it was all being documented. The child's light had dimmed. Her joy was buried beneath anxiety and confusion. But behind the walls of that house, something stronger than fear was taking root. Judith thought she was winning. She had no idea what was coming next. The chalk drawing was innocent, almost heartbreakingly so. It had taken hours for the small child to complete, her arms straining as she maneuvered the colored sticks from her wheelchair, carefully sketching flowers, a smiling sun, and the words, "Thank you for being kind," in oversized, crooked letters across the front sidewalk. It wasn't art for attention or praise. It was a hopeful gesture, the expression of a child trying to understand a world that seemed to be pushing her away. The message wasn't just written in chalk, it was written in trust. The next morning, it was gone. Every trace scrubbed clean. The pastel dust that had settled into the pavement was hosed away, the ground scrubbed to a dull gray. In its place, a printed HOA warning was left inside a plastic sleeve taped to the mailbox. The notice cited graffiti and unsanctioned markings on shared property as a violation of neighborhood code, warning of potential fines and further corrective measures. Attached was a blurry photo of the child's drawing, circled in red ink. The image was labeled visual disturbance. The destruction of the artwork broke something, not just in the child, but in the atmosphere of the home itself. No one had spoken the words, But the line had been crossed. There was no longer any ambiguity, no misinterpretation possible. This wasn't about policy. It wasn't about neighborhood standards. It was about erasure. Judith didn't want coexistence, she wanted silence. That afternoon, Judith returned. This time, she didn't wait at the property line. She stormed up the front steps, fists clenched, her mouth, already forming words before the door was even halfway open. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the still air with a venom that no longer attempted to mask itself behind civility. She accused the family of weaponizing sympathy and abusing the Americans with Disabilities Act to bypass neighborhood protocol. She called the medical ramp a permanent eyesore and said the service dog was one bark away from a lawsuit. Her words came faster, louder. She pointed at the camera above the door and called it harassment. She screamed that the home had become a public display of victimhood and that children like that belong in care facilities, not family homes. Then she slammed a rolled-up HOA policy packet against the doorframe and marched away without waiting for a reply. What followed wasn't anger, but urgency. It was clear that talking, reasoning, even documenting was no longer enough. This wasn't just neighborhood politics. It had become a legal and safety issue. A disability rights advocate was contacted, a specialist in ADA compliance and housing law. After reviewing the evidence, every letter, photo, voice recording, and camera clip, the advocate's tone shifted from professional to alarmed. She said flatly, "This is targeted abuse, and it's escalating." Formal complaints were filed through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. A cease and desist letter was drafted and sent directly to the HOA board. Legal protections were cited in bold, underlined sections. Violations were listed. Deadlines were given. The advocate also notified local authorities, informing them of a developing civil rights case. The tone changed slightly after that. The HOA grew quieter. Judith stopped speaking in public, stopped appearing at the door, and even missed 2 board meetings in a row. But the silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like the quiet before something worse. Whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. Small, sharp rumors carefully planted to poison public opinion. Some said the family had filed frivolous lawsuits. Others claimed the child's condition was being exaggerated for sympathy. A few neighbors even muttered that the service dog was fake. The shift was subtle but deliberate. The real campaign had moved underground. Meanwhile, something else was changing, something darker. Judith began leaving her blinds open. Through the windows, she could be seen rearranging things in her living room, moving chairs away from the bay window, setting up a long, rectangular case on the coffee table. Some neighbors spotted her at the local gun range. Word spread that she had recently purchased a new handgun, a matte black pistol she referred to as a personal safety measure. She had mentioned it offhandedly at the grocery store checkout line, saying, "You never know who'll snap these days." When asked by a neighbor why she suddenly needed a gun after decades without one, she replied, "I just feel threatened lately. Things around here aren't like they used to be. You try to uphold standards and people come for you." A receipt for a recent ammunition purchase later turned up, discarded in the community recycling bin. Printed across the top was her name, and below it, a list of items. 9mm hollow points, a concealed carry holster, and safety targets shaped like silhouettes. One neighbor claimed to have seen her practicing drawing the weapon from her handbag in her backyard, pointing it toward the fence line and mouthing something under her breath. No one called the police. No one intervened. The disability rights advocate advised the family to document everything, double their home surveillance, and begin preparing for the possibility of court protection orders. She mentioned, in a hushed tone, that this case wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. "This woman is fixated," she warned, and fixation, when combined with perceived threats to power, often turns volatile. The child, now withdrawn and hyper-aware of everything around her, began flinching at sudden movements. Her sleep was fractured. Her play sessions shortened. Even Milo, normally a calm and gentle dog, had grown anxious, pacing near doors and barking at sounds no one else heard. The home no longer felt like a home. It felt like a bunker, and outside, Judith's house sat like a watchtower. Despite the rising threat, the family didn't leave. Not because they weren't scared, but because leaving would mean surrender. It would mean validating every action Judith had taken to push them out. And most importantly, it would mean teaching a child that standing up for your right to exist was futile. Still, the weight was becoming unbearable. Every sound outside triggered adrenaline. Every knock at the door sent hearts racing. The neighborhood, the once quiet, tree-lined neighborhood meant to be a haven, had turned into a war zone built on passive aggression, legal loopholes, and weaponized authority. And Judith was growing bolder again. She started walking her dog past the house twice a day instead of once. She no longer avoided the cameras. Instead, she looked directly into them. One day, she paused mid-walk, reached into her handbag, and slowly zipped it closed while staring straight at the lens. The message wasn't subtle. She wanted to be seen. She wanted them to know. No longer hiding her disdain, she made one final move before everything spiraled out of control. She submitted a formal HOA motion, written in her name, only requesting mandatory review of residency eligibility in cases of persistent disruption. In her letter, she cited ongoing strain on community cohesion due to individual needs outweighing collective comfort. She ended with one sentence, typed in italics. Perhaps relocation is the most appropriate resolution. The board didn't vote on the motion. Most members ignored it. A few expressed quiet concern, but no one reprimanded her. No one stopped her. By then, the warnings were no longer metaphors. They were becoming real, tangible, loaded. The situation was no longer about violations or disagreements. It was about a woman who believed she was above consequence, a woman who saw empathy as weakness and vulnerability as offense. She had spent months weaponizing the rules. Now she was preparing to weaponize something else. And even then, in the shadow of everything she'd done, she still believed herself the victim. Something terrible was coming. Everyone felt it. No one did anything to stop it. The sun was warm and steady that afternoon. After days of clouds and tension, the sky had finally cleared, stretching wide and blue above the cul-de-sac like a promise of peace. It was the kind of day that should have belonged to childhood, simple, soft, and safe. The child was out front, a small bottle of bubble solution gripped tightly in her hands, her wheelchair angled toward the breeze. She dipped the wand carefully, her fingers trembling with concentration, then blew, gently. Dozens of tiny orbs floated into the air, catching the sunlight and shimmering like glass. Her laughter followed them, light and free for the first time in days. The dog, Milo, lay at her side on the lawn, ears alert but relaxed, tail flicking now and then at the movement of the bubbles. For a few moments, everything felt still, no footsteps, no raised voices, no HOA letters or accusing glances. Just a father watching his daughter play, holding onto a rare moment of peace that neither of them could fully trust, but both desperately needed. Then came the bark. Short, high-pitched, and sharp. Not from Milo, but from across the street. Judith's Pomeranian, all fluff and fury, was tugging on its leash, snapping at the air. Judith stood a few feet behind it. Her mouth twisted into the same thin-lipped frown she always wore when she passed the house. But this time, she didn't just pass. She stopped. The child turned toward the noise. Milo raised his head, ears perked, tail still. The little dog barked again, louder, more frantic, and then lunged forward on the leash. The tension in the moment shifted instantly. Judith staggered slightly, startled by her dog's sudden movement. Her eyes darted to the child, then to Milo, who had stood up now, calm, protective between her and the approaching noise. Judith reached into her handbag. It happened too fast for anyone to understand. Her hands fumbled inside the bag, fingers clawing through lipstick tubes and loose receipts. Her dog was still barking. The service dog gave one low, warning growl. Then Judith pulled something free from the purse, a gun, small and dark, barely larger than her hand. Her grip was uncertain, one finger already curling toward the trigger. She shouted something. No one understood it. The gun went off. A single, deafening crack tore through the afternoon air. The bubbles vanished in an instant. The child jerked forward, a sound escaping her lips that no parent should ever have to hear. A sharp, stunned cry that was half breath, half confusion. She slumped in her wheelchair, her bubble wand slipping from her hand. Blood began to spread across her dress, a deep red stain blossoming from her stomach, soaking the soft pink fabric she'd picked out herself that morning. Milo barked once, loud, urgent, frantic, then positioned himself beside her, whining as she slumped sideways. Screams rang out, not just from the house, but from across the street, where a neighbor had stepped outside, just in time to see the moment unfold. Judith stood frozen, still holding the weapon. Her face was pale, eyes wide. Her dog barked once more, then fell silent. Her mouth moved again, and this time the words were clear. "I was just scared," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. She startled me." The front door slammed open. Running footsteps, the child's name being shouted over and over. The voice cracked on the third repetition. Knees hit the pavement hard, hands pressed against her abdomen, trying to stop the bleeding. She looked up, her eyes glassy with shock, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but couldn't. Her breath came in tiny gasps. Someone called 911. Someone else shouted for towels. A neighbor ran across the lawn with a phone in hand, screaming into it. She shot her. She shot the little girl. But everything else became noise, distant, warped like underwater echoes. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics worked fast, moving with rehearsed urgency as they stabilized her tiny body, loading her into the gurney while blood soaked through gauze and gloves. One of them shouted vitals into a radio, another inserted, and four mid-run. The wheels of the gurney hit the ramp, newly repaired, just barely wide enough. The father climbed in behind her. The dog remained on the driveway, leash still looped around the wheelchair's handle, watching the sirens fade in the distance. Judith didn't run. She didn't move. She dropped the gun without being told and stood perfectly still as the first officer arrived, weapon drawn, shouting commands. She raised her hand slowly as if trying to appear calm, but her voice betrayed her, shaky, high-pitched, barely coherent. "She scared me," she said again, more urgently this time, as if repeating the words would change what had happened. The dog jumped. She moved too fast. I didn't mean to. She was handcuffed on the lawn in full view of the neighborhood. Someone filmed it. A few people watched from behind curtains. No one stepped forward. No one defended her. Not even her dog barked. The arrest was swift, the reading of her rights clinical. She continued sobbing as she was guided into the back of a squad car. When asked if the weapon was registered, she nodded. When asked if she had any prior training, she hesitated. "Just basic," she said. I didn't want to use it. I was just scared." At the hospital, the child was rushed into emergency surgery. The bullet had torn through soft tissue, but missed vital organs by inches. Still, her body was small, her blood loss rapid, and the outcome uncertain. Hours passed. Friends gathered. Calls were made. News began to spread. Outside the hospital room, a pair of detectives reviewed the video footage from the front door. The clip was clear. No threats. No aggression. A child playing with bubbles. A startled woman pulling a weapon. A shot fired. There was no ambiguity. There was no justification. The headlines came next. Local, then regional, then national. HOA president shoots disabled child in broad daylight. Karen claims fear led to gunfire. Interviews began flooding in from neighbors who had stayed silent for months. Anonymous statements. Past grievances. Patterns of discrimination that had gone unspoken. But none of that mattered in the hours that followed, as the family waited for word on whether their little girl would wake up, whether the laughter that had once filled the front yard would ever return, whether the trust broken by a single bullet could ever be rebuilt. Back at the house, the bubble wand lay on the driveway. The wind had knocked it sideways. The bottle was still open, its soapy contents reflecting the afternoon light. A small, forgotten shape, innocent, harmless, and terribly unbearably quiet. The cold, sterile lights of the ICU made time feel hollow. Monitors beeped rhythmically, counting every fragile breath that escaped the child's body. Tubes snaked from her arms, machines hummed beside her, and an oxygen mask covered most of her small, pale face. Her hair, always neatly braided, lay matted against the pillow. The doctors spoke in low, guarded tones, careful not to make promises they couldn't keep. She was alive, but barely. The bullet had ruptured her small intestine and missed her kidney by less than half an inch. Emergency surgery had stopped the bleeding, but there were concerns about infection, about long-term internal damage, and most terrifying of all, whether her fragile body had the strength to recover. Her father hadn't left her side. For days, he sat next to her bed in the same chair, face unshaven, hands clasped tightly together in prayer, even though he hadn't prayed in years. Nurses brought him coffee he didn't drink. Friends offered words he couldn't hear. Nothing mattered beyond the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the hospital sheets. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, the world was watching. News outlets ran the story with images of her school photo and the blurred footage from the home security camera. Social media exploded with outrage. Tens of thousands of people reposted her story, some with disbelief, others with fury. The phrase "just scared" trended across multiple platforms, often accompanied by hashtags like hashtag Justice for Emily and hashtag Not an Accident. A neighbor, one the family barely knew, set up a GoFundMe to cover medical expenses. Within 48 hours, it passed $150,000. Donations came from strangers, fellow parents of disabled children, veterans, even retired police officers. The comments section was filled with prayers, personal stories, and messages of support from people who said they'd never been so angry on behalf of someone they didn't know. But not everyone was remorseful. Karen, whose real name was Judith Ransom, was out on bail within 36 hours of her arrest. She wore sunglasses and a trench coat when reporters caught her coming out of the courthouse. Her lawyer did the talking, calling it a terrible misunderstanding and insisting she was fully cooperating. No apology, no expression of regret, just a short statement about Judith being a longtime community leader who had made a split-second decision under perceived threat. Her bail had been quietly paid by an HOA legal fund. The HOA tried to stay silent, but the press wouldn't let them. Soon, they issued a brief public statement distancing themselves from Judith. Ms. Ransom's actions were taken in her personal capacity and not on behalf of the HOA, the email read. But neighbors began speaking up, anonymously at first, sharing stories of Judith's long history of aggressive complaints, confrontations, and disturbing comments about the child next door. She always said the girl's presence brought drama to the neighborhood, one neighbor wrote, as if a child in a wheelchair was some kind of threat. 2 days later, things took a sudden, damning turn. A man named Reggie Walters, who lived 3 doors down, posted a grainy cell phone video taken weeks before the shooting. In it, Judith could be seen standing across the street from the family's home, holding the exact same gun she later used. She wasn't firing it, but she brandished it openly, shouting at the father, telling him to control his animal or she'd take care of it herself. The clip was only 23 seconds long, but it was enough. When prosecutors reviewed it, they immediately refiled. The original charges, reckless endangerment and assault, were dropped in favor of something far more serious, attempted murder in the first degree. Judith was rearrested. This time, no bail was offered. That same night, Reggie spoke to reporters. His voice trembled during the interview, guilt etched into every word. "I should have shown the video earlier," he said. "I didn't think it would come to this. I just didn't want to get involved. I was scared of her, too." The video went viral. People began demanding an investigation into the HOA itself. How much they had known, how many complaints they had ignored, and whether Judith had been empowered by her position to bully the family without consequence. Old emails surfaced showing how she had used official HOA letterhead to threaten fines over the placement of a wheelchair ramp, and how she described the service dog as a neighborhood liability. While the legal storm swirled, the child remained unconscious. Her body was healing slowly, but she hadn't woken up yet. Doctors said it might take more time, or that she might wake up disoriented, traumatized, in pain. The father stayed with her every night, often sitting in silence, other times reading her favorite book in a soft, steady voice, just in case she could hear. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hospital parking lot, her fingers twitched. At first, it was barely noticeable, but then her eyelids fluttered. The monitor beeped faster. The nurse called for the doctor, who rushed in just as her eyes slowly opened. She looked around, confused, then locked eyes with her father. She tried to speak, but couldn't. Tears welled up instead. He grabbed her hand. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're okay, baby. I've got you." Back at the courthouse, Judith appeared again, this time in an orange jumpsuit, hands shackled, face devoid of makeup or pretense. The judge denied her motion to dismiss the new charges. The DA's office announced their intent to pursue the maximum penalty, citing clear evidence of prior intent and a history of targeted harassment. The community's anger hadn't faded, it had sharpened. Protesters gathered outside HOA offices. Online petitions demanded the dissolution of the HOA entirely. National advocacy groups picked up the story, launching campaigns for stricter gun laws, harsher consequences for ableism, and accountability for homeowner boards abusing power. But for the family, it wasn't about politics. It was about safety, about justice, about making sure no other child ever had to fear stepping outside her home because someone with a clipboard and a bias thought she didn't belong. 1 week after the shooting, the father gave a brief statement outside the hospital. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. His voice was calm but firm, every word measured like a promise. "My daughter is alive. She is a fighter, but she never should have had to fight. What happened to her wasn't a mistake. It wasn't fear. It was hate, and we're going to see this through all the way to the end, not just for her, but for every kid who's ever been told they're too different to be safe in their own neighborhood." The cameras kept rolling, but across the street, back at the quiet cul-de-sac, the house sat in silence. No bubbles, no laughter, just a hand-drawn sign taped to the front door, written in shaky marker letters: "She's strong. She's coming home soon." The courtroom felt colder than it should have. Pale beige walls, long oak benches, a judge with tired eyes. The buzz of murmured voices fell silent when Judith Ransom was brought in, clad in a wrinkled jumpsuit, wrists shackled, eyes hollow. She looked thinner. Her signature smug confidence was gone, replaced by a taut grimace that flickered each time the prosecution presented evidence. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the hallway from being packed with media, advocates, and supporters holding signs that read justice for Emily. Judith's attorney entered a plea of not guilty. They argued it had all been a tragic misunderstanding, that Judith had suffered from undiagnosed PTSD, possibly brought on by a past home invasion, that the father's confrontational behavior and the service dog's presence had triggered her fight or flight response. The shooting, they claimed, wasn't hate, it was trauma. The courtroom held its breath when the defense went further, suggesting the disabled girl might have startled Judith and referencing secondhand reports that she had been known to yell uncontrollably in public. There were audible gasps. The father sat stone-faced beside his daughter, who now bore a long surgical scar under her hospital gown and the quiet, deep wisdom of someone who had survived the unthinkable. But the defense underestimated the jury and the world watching. The prosecution delivered testimony that stripped Judith's excuses down to the bone. Doctors confirmed that the child had been calm at the time of the incident. Surveillance footage showed Judith holding the gun with intention, stepping forward, not back, before pulling the trigger. And then came the wave of witness accounts. Nearly a dozen neighbors testified about Judith's harassment over the years. One had recorded her screaming about the unfair noise of the wheelchair ramp being installed. Another revealed emails where Judith called the family a disruption to the community harmony. HOA meeting minutes, uncovered by a local journalist, showed she had tried to push through a policy banning visible medical equipment from front yards, including ramps and oxygen tanks. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A quiet man in a gray suit, mid-50s, was called to the stand by the prosecution. His name was Dr. Elijah Kramer, a retired professor who had once served on the same HOA board, long before Judith ever held a seat. The courtroom leaned forward as he adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and told his story. Judith hadn't risen to power in the HOA by accident. Her late husband, Charles Ransom, had once been president of that very HOA. Years ago, Charles had stepped down abruptly after multiple families filed formal complaints of racial discrimination. One family had accused him of refusing their pool key access because their children were biracial. Another reported that he denied fence repair requests to a disabled black veteran, citing neighborhood aesthetic. The complaints were quietly settled. No public statement was ever made. But Charles was forced to resign, and in the shadows, Judith stepped up to fill his place. This wasn't about fear, Dr. Kramer said plainly from the stand. This was about legacy. Judith believed she was preserving something ugly and old, passed down through her husband. And when she couldn't control the neighborhood anymore, she lashed out. It landed like thunder in the courtroom. Judith's attorney tried to object, tried to discredit Kramer as a disgruntled former member, but the damage was done. The prosecution rested their case with one final point: Judith had never once shown remorse. Not after the shooting, not in the hospital, not even in court. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When they returned, no one breathed. The foreman stood, eyes steady, and announced, "We find the defendant Judith Ransom guilty on all counts." The judge sentenced her to 18 years in federal prison, the maximum for attempted murder with aggravating circumstances. She would not be eligible for parole for at least 14 years. There were no cheers, just tears, quiet ones from the family, from the courtroom, and from strangers who had followed every step of the journey. But even justice couldn't undo the damage. In the months that followed, the family focused entirely on healing. The girl went through 3 more surgeries and over 60 hours of physical therapy. She struggled with nightmares, with pain, and with the raw ache of fear every time she heard a loud noise. But she also had strength and laughter and a whole world of people who now stood behind her, cheering for her recovery. The father quit his job to stay home and care for her full time. He began writing articles, short, honest reflections about parenting a child with disabilities in a world that often felt cruel. His posts went viral. He started a blog, then partnered with disability advocacy groups to help others facing similar battles. The HOA, meanwhile, collapsed under its own shame. A class action suit was filed by multiple residents, and in the fallout, the HOA board resigned en masse. The association itself was dissolved within 6 months. In its place, a volunteer-led neighborhood alliance formed, focused on inclusion, kindness, and transparency. Exactly 1 year after the shooting, the family hosted a quiet birthday celebration in their backyard. No reporters, no cameras, just friends, neighbors, balloons, and a single beautiful cake. The little girl, now 8 years old, wore a sparkly purple dress and stood tall on her leg braces, gripping her walker proudly as the crowd sang to her. She had grown an inch. Her face had changed, matured, not just from age, but from everything she'd endured. After blowing out the candles, she looked around and said with a small smile, "I'm not afraid anymore." Her father, watching from a few feet away, couldn't hold back the tears. Later that night, as he tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead, he lingered at the door, gazing at her peaceful face. He thought back to the moment that had nearly stolen everything from them: the rage, the fear, the pain, and how, somehow, love had endured. They had survived. He whispered quietly, almost to himself, "Karen took a shot at my daughter, but she missed everything that truly matters." If this story moved you, please hit that like button to support families like ours, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories where justice always finds a way.